When I first started programming, I started with front-end development because as an ex-building architect, I really loved being able to design and implement applications. And so this here is my second project ever, which is a weather app that I designed and built. And I thought it came out really, really, really well. So I was excited to share it with my friends and family, hoping for a little bit of praise. But I didn't get the response I was hoping for. They responded more like, yeah, yeah, okay. And that's because this is what they saw. Yeah, let's look at this in depth. Um, you can see that this Francesca did not know what responsive design was. You can see that everything literally fell apart the moment we changed the browser width because it was only built for one size. So I'm sure a lot of you know the importance of CSS and responsive design to prevent bad websites like this, but I'm guessing a lot of you still feel more like this when you encounter CSS. Um, I want to help you avoid this pain and not be like Peter here by introducing to you a process I have developed over the last few years of suffering with CSS and responsive design. I also want to help answer some common questions like how do we handle the in-between sizes if we're only given a desktop and mobile mockup? And is it mobile first or desktop first when we write CSS? At the end of the day, these are actually designer questions, and to answer them, we need to put on our designer hat. So the goal of my presentation today is to first define design from an engineer's perspective, then give you some practice through case studies to build up that design intuition, and then I'll give you my real-world engineering tips to translating design to code for projects. All right, so you may be thinking, Francesca, responsive design is not that hard, right? We just have to collapse everything into a single column on mobile and use things like media queries to make it happen, right? And yeah, technically, this is responsive in that nothing looks absolutely wrong and weird, but I would consider this to be more a responsive layout as opposed to a responsive design. So what's the difference? Responsive layouts and the underlying tools such as media queries and Flex, these are just techniques used to achieve responsive design. So then what's responsive design? To answer that, we need to get even more abstract and answer what is design? Um, so for us as engineers, we deal with a subset of design where our designers are answering questions that users will have when they arrive on our applications. Questions like, how do I buy this thing? And wait, is this a real site or what is this site, right? So then a designer's job is to arrange this information and then create interactions to help answer these users' questions. Um, okay, so now that we have a better understanding of what design is, responsive design is just a continuation of all of that, where we're just continuing to solve problems for a user on all devices and interactions that a user will experience. Okay, so we know what responsive design is. Why do we need to know that specific? Like, why does this matter? Essentially, I want us to unblock ourselves when we get stuck. So when we work in the front end, designers have already done the hard work of answering a user's questions and then hands it off to us developers as mockups, right? So it's our job to implement it and ensure that the design intent is visible in all sizes. Then that common question comes back into play. How do we implement this at the in-between sizes if we're only given like the desktop and mobile screens, right? Of course, it would be ideal to have mockups in all sizes, including the in-between sizes, but that's just probably not feasible for our designers. So to unblock ourselves, I think it's important for developers to learn how to generally discern a design intent so we can do our best effort in helping designers implement their visions. All right, so the following case studies are going to be multi-purposed. They are all technically responsive layouts, but I hope to show how the design intent was unintentionally disrupted when it was collapsed down. And for us to do that, we need to know what the design intent was, right? So I'm also going to walk through some tricks I use to figure out what the layout intent was, and then use it to gauge the effectiveness and the other widths. Um, I also want to preface all of this by saying responsive layout techniques can be used the majority of the time to take a desktop design to mobile and meet all the design requirements. The case studies I'm about to show you are just more exceptions purposely picked out to show you the limits of applying the technique without much thought and how it can ultimately weaken a design intent. Okay. All the case studies are based off of real examples. They've been anonymized, so let's just get started with our first one. So this is a product's landing page, right? And when I'm looking at this set of content here, I can see that between the layouts of these elements and the arrows in between, I think I'm looking at a step-by-step process for this company, right? First, we're going to create an account. 2, connect Stripe. 3, generate links. 4, share the links. Okay, so let's look at this in mobile. You can see that once we switch to mobile, still perfectly responsive in that everything is formatted nicely, nothing's poken out. But I would say that this has lost its design intent, right? And that's because, unfortunately, the arrows have kept this horizontal positioning. So it's less clear that this is a step-by-step process. And now I think this is just kind of like semi-related elements, and this is something I can maybe click on instead. So how would we fix this, right? This one's actually a pretty easy fix. We can just switch the arrows to a vertical one. And now between these two layouts, you can see that the one on the right is much clearer that this is actually a step-by-step process, like we were intending on the desktop. Okay, so for this next case study, this comes from a responsive design blog, and I love the example so much that I built it into this presentation. So for this case study, let's try a different technique to discern the design intent. I want us all to look at this mockup and just let your eyes wander on the page and notice what your eyes are drawn to. In this case, for me, the biggest thing that I'm drawn to is this victors and villains image grid. And then second, I noticed this really large logo in the corner. Third is this text. And fourth is the navigational elements here. So by letting your eyes just um, let your eyes notice what it's drawn to, you can also use this to gauge the visual hierarchy that the designer was trying to maintain. So here, clearly, we were trying to draw attention to these two elements, and these number 3 and 4 were just coming as lower priority. Okay, let's look at the two mobile versions. As you can see, both are perfectly responsive, but I find myself leaning towards the one on the right. Let's try and understand why we may be liking this one more as an effective version. Oh gosh, my bad. Sorry. Yep. Okay. Okay. So let's look at the left one first, right? You can see that this is clearly the same desktop layout. We've just narrowed it down in width. But now that it's a narrower layout, the thing that used to be the biggest element on the layout, which is the victors and villains image grid, is much smaller on this version. And all of the elements feel like they're competing and they're like equal in its visual hierarchy, right? So I'm not really sure what I'm looking at. I'm just looking at all of it at once. In comparison, if we were to look at the layout on the right, if we like just notice what your eyes were drawn to immediately, right? Like victors and villains image grid, I'm seeing the logo and the text like second, and then the navigational items are the last thing. And if we were to remember our desktop priorities, you can see that that same ordering of things you were noticing are the same between desktop and mobile. And I think this is why I am more drawn to this particular layout as a effective version of this of the desktop version. Okay, so I want to end this section by reiterating that all of these layouts were responsive, but the design intent either became different or was weakened when we implemented the responsive layouts without much thought. I also hope that walking through these examples gives you some ways to identify and assess a design intent. If nothing else, you can use all of this information to help you have a conversation with your designers. You can ask questions such as, what is important in this mockup and why? And what is the priority of the elements? These questions will help you implement responsive design for the in-between sizes. Okay, so we have a general idea on what a design intent is, hopefully, and how to tell whether it's being applied. Let's move on to our practical tips. Let's start off with CSS Basics. So a lot of you probably already know this, and this is just going to be review, but I just want to make sure we're all starting on the same page. So bear with me. Um, Starting with CSS box model. So everything in CSS is a box, whether it's a text element, div, buttons, all of them are just boxes. And each box are made up of parts. We start off with the most internal part is a content. Here I've put in a hello world text. Then there's a padding around it, then a border. And this is actually the limits of what you would visually see for the box because surrounding that is a margin, which I like to think of as a invisible force field that pushes things away from the internals of our box. And yes, next there is box sizing. So this can easily mess with your layouts. For example, elements just poking out or displaying larger than you expected. And to show you what I mean, both of these boxes have been created with the same padding, border, margin, width, and height. But you can see that the two sizes are completely different, right? And that's because the one on the left has a box sizing content box, and the one on the right is a border box. So let's break this down, right? When we define a width of 600 and a height of 400 pixels, the default behavior in CSS is that it would be used to calculate the interior content part of the box. So you can see here we have a 600 by 400 content. Padding and borders are then applied on top of that width. So if we actually calculated the border to border width of this box, it comes out as 760 pixels. On the other hand, with the border box, uh, it uses the 600 pixel width to define border to border width. And then from there, it calculates inwards and applies the like border width, the padding, and then anything else remaining is left to the content. So as you can see here, the interior content is 480 by 280. I think most people are probably expecting this behavior when they defined a 600 by 400 box. Either way, I think this is really important for you to know the difference so that you could switch between them as needed. Okay, next, CSS positioning. So I generally use flex for one directional positioning. And by that, I mean, I only care about how the elements are laid out in one direction. And then I use grid for two directional layouts. So for example, a page layout with a header on the side and a bunch of content in between, I'm trying to lay it out in two directions. So with Flex, it's really easy to get started. We first set display Flex and then control the direction of it by using Flex direction. So here, row essentially creates a horizontal element because we have elements side by side. And then column creates a vertical set of elements because the children are stacked on top of each other. From there, most common set of controls I use then are justify content, which is to control the main axis positioning, and then align items for cross-axis positioning. This probably doesn't make much sense, so let me give you an example. If you were to define a flex direction of row, so just exactly how this diagram is, where we have a horizontal element, the justify content would be controlling the horizontal positioning, right? And then align items would be controlling the vertical positioning of the elements. If you were to define flex direction column, these two would switch. Very confusing, I know. But essentially between these properties, that's 99% of what I do with flex. So just to also show you like where I would be putting flex, here's a layout. And these are the parts where I would just be sprinkling flex because these are technically one directional layouts and it's just easy for me to just put it in. So for example, here, this header set of links, I just set flex direction low, row, justify content space between, right? So this kind of gives you an idea of where you can be putting flex. So some shortcomings though. I find it hard to read for some of the more complex stuff. And I have, there's some like inconsistencies with Flex that I've like detailed here that I can read about that I don't really like. So essentially, if I hit any problems with Flex where I just can't do it exactly the way I want to do it the first time around, I just switch over to CSS Grid as it's totally able to handle these one-dimensional elements as well. Speaking of grid, so essentially everything is defined in terms of columns, right? Columns and rows. Then we can place elements within your defined grid and take up as many rows and columns as you defined. Um, Again, this is what I prefer to use for two-directional layouts, and let me show you why. So this here is a fixed 4-column grid with 16 pixel gaps. And I've put the CSS code to achieve this in both Flex and Grid. So let's start over here with Flex. And this is actually an example that I pulled from a real project. So this does happen, okay? So to create the grid gap effect, both the parent and the child classes need to know about it, right? It's calculating 16 pixels here on both sides. And then to create the 4-column effect, the parent has flex wrap, and then the child has flex 24%. What the hell does that mean, right? Essentially, this is saying that each child will neither shrink or grow, and it's going to start off with a width of 25%. That coupled with the max width 25%, we're essentially saying stay 25% wide. And this is how it's creating this effect. In contrast, if we were to do this in grid, I can say grid template columns, repeat for 1FR. Essentially, this is saying I want 4 equal size columns with a grid gap of 16 pixels. So what I really like about this is that this is much more readable to me about what it's doing. And most importantly, everything related to the layout, including the gapping and the sizing, it can stay within its parent's responsibility here. Because you can see here that the child no longer needs to know that like the spacing around it was supposed to be 16 pixels of a gap, right? And it didn't need to know that I'm supposed to be a 25% width thing. It can just continue styling on its internal stuff. Um, some shortcomings. So even though I love CSS Grid, uh, the major problem is that there is a lack of Internet Explorer support. Um, it's still feasible, but there's some setup required to achieve this, and I would highly recommend you to read through the articles on this link as it will help you set that up. I also just learned recently that React Native does not support CSS Grid, so that's too bad for you guys. Okay, so CSS media queries and breakpoints. So this is essentially the backbone of responsive layouts. So essentially when a browser width changes, we want to define how the CSS would change at that particular width, or aka a breakpoint, by using CSS media queries. I think a lot of you probably already know this. So the new thing that I'm offering here is that I have a set of constants that I use with me, that I bring around with me, that defines a set of breakpoints. This is creating custom breakpoints in different layouts or projects, as that's really hard to maintain. Okay, project setup tips. As I mentioned before, right? Like I carry around a set of CSS constants with me. So here I usually carry a color palette or whatever my theme color set is, and then I also have the breakpoints. Yes, this is not a typo. I have copied and pasted the same breakpoints as both CSS variables and Sass variables. There is a reason for this, primarily due to like inconsistencies with how like CSS, I can use these variables in CSS statements. It's very annoying, but we're just gonna move forward. Um, Next, I would set up any content containers if my layouts need it. So typically there are two types of common layouts on the internet, right? First is a dashboard type where we're just trying to fit as much information as possible. And so even if we were to stretch this window on an ultra wide monitor, all of the content moves with it. We don't need any special setup for this. Um, what we do need to prep for is the second type, which is the majority of websites you probably see. What's happening here is that we have a content with a maximum width here and flexible spaces on the side so that even on an ultra-wide monitor, this fixed content stays the same in the middle and the spacing on the side just gets larger the bigger you stretch it. This pattern is primarily because it's just pretty taxing for our eyes to scan content at larger widths. So to prepare for this, let me show you an example through code. So I'm gonna change my screen share. One moment. Uh, uh, uh. Oh no. Oh yes. Okay. If you can see my screen. All right. So this here is a site about my COVID cats, Obi and Aurelius, who are very, very handsome cats. So I have already set up the layout max width content container here. And so to show you how it works, right? Like as I stretch this out, the spacing on the sides gets bigger, the content stays the same in the middle. And when I go narrower, the padding disappears and the content just follows the browser's width. So how did I do this? So here in the CSS, I have a full bleed layout set up. And essentially this one line is controlling this responsive column like um, effect that we're seeing. So essentially this middle column is saying, choose the smallest size of either screen MD or 100%. If there's any more space, um, if there was any more spaces on the side, we're going to reallocate it to these two 1FRs. From here, this line is saying that on default, all of wrapper's children are going to be in this middle column. And there's also a full bleed class where if we were to put it on an element, it would tell it to 100% of the width. So just to give you an example, I think that I want you to see an even bigger picture of my cats. So let's go full bleed. And you can see that it just was that easy for me to just tell it to take up the 100% of the width. Still perfectly responsive, right? So that even when I go smaller, the padding disappears on both and it's very easy to work with. Okay, so jumping back into my slides, one moment. Hold on. Okay, so if you wanted to see that example, by the way, and play with it yourself, I have the code pen here, so you can check it out. Um, all right, so concepts to know. Define fixed widths and heights sparingly. So this isn't really a project setup tip, more like a recommendation. I used to define widths and heights in all of my elements, but it quickly became a game of whack-a-mole where whenever I changed something in one place, something else kept breaking. And so I just like redid my entire like process of doing this. And I've just tried to let my layout classes control the sizing of elements and then let children adopt the width and heights from its parents unless we absolutely need to define it somewhere. For CSS organization, for media queries, I used to put media queries because it was changing, but this was really hard to maintain for larger projects as it's kind of like hard to keep in your mind what parts are going to change when all of the media queries are distributed like that. So I recommend having a class act purely as a wrapping layout container. And then so when styling needs to change for a particular breakpoint, we're going to consolidate all of that in one place. Um, Second tip is just to prevent any accidental styling override issues. I organize my child classes first, and then any classes that wrap them are after it. So uh, uh, if were to give you an example of a page layout style sheet, the most parent wrapping class would be defined last, aka at the bottom of the sheet, so it can reference the child classes above it without any issues. This also works in something like CSS and JS. Okay, responsive layout process. I'm going to walk through this kind of fast because we're going to actually be doing this exercise together in a live demo. But essentially, I would be one, implementing the layout at the largest width. Second, the mobile one. And then I would go back to the desktop version and then start narrowing my browser until I find a point where like design starts to fall apart. That's a seam. And then identify the closest breakpoint to that, write the styling, and then keep iterating number 3 and 4 until we're all the way back down to mobile. Side note, steps 1 and 2 are interchangeable. This is just a personal choice. As long as it's still important that you consider both desktop and mobile together as you're writing it. All right, so I threw a lot at you guys. Let's put everything we learned together by implementing this mockup here. So this is the live coding section. Um, let's hope this goes well. Okay, so let me change my screen now. 1 moment. Hmm. Sorry. Advanced. New share portion of screen. All right. Do you guys see my new? Um, I guess I need to put this somewhere else. My new screen share.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And let me just move some things out of the way. Okay. So let's just start off with looking at the mocks again, right? So we have a desktop version and a mobile version. Right off the bat, I can see that there are three main pieces of this layout, that has been collapsed into a single column on mobile. Um, so let's look at our starter here, starter code. So I've taken the time to just set up the HTML elements and some basic styling, so we're not starting from the absolute beginning. Um, the way I organize this, let me make this a little bigger actually, is that we have the wrapper class again. So we have a max width content set up. You can see it playing here. Then I have a page container, which is where I'm going to be storing all of my layout specific styling. And then I've defined each part as like, this is going to be the small container class, medium container, and this is the main container. Um, when we're laying out HTML, my one tip is that you should be considering both desktop and mobile at the same time as you're writing out the HTML because it's going to directly affect how you would be laying out the elements and which elements are going to be wrapped together. So to show you an example, um, okay, here, for example, I can see that sorry, let me use this one as an example. This card on desktop, if I were to just look at the desktop example, I would have maybe said like, oh, actually, maybe these are just going to be 2 columns, right? But when I look at it in mobile, you can see that this text actually left the lines to the left. So if I had kept it in those two columns, it would have made it hard for me to do this effect in mobile. So knowing that, I would actually change this out to the two columns and two rows to give me the flexibility to change it later. Here's another example. This doesn't have a flex version, but essentially, sorry, a mobile equivalent, but um, I can see already that I want to make this a row essentially. And to make it easier for myself, like I can see these two elements are joined together and gonna be aligned to the right. So if I wrap this together in its own div, then put all of it together with a flex direction row with the justify content space between, it can very easily create this effect. Okay, so now let's actually look at our code again. So with the CSS, like I said before, I had some setup here. Actually, let me know if this is too small. But we have the constants again, the full bleed layout setup, some just default styling here, and then as well as I've laid out, I've separated the layouts containers just so that it makes it easier for us to start putting code in here. Okay, so before we get started with laying out the desktop, I want to point something out to you right now. Do you see here that I have a horizontal scroll here? You see something poking out? Does this ring any bells of what this is? Um, so if you look at the text area class, you can see that I have defined it to be width 100%, but it's still poking out. And so this is actually a box sizing issue. And if I were to just change this to border box, you can see that it just came right back in the way I was expecting it to. And now we don't have any horizontal scrolling. Okay, so just wanted to point that out because I thought it was cool and relevant. Okay, let's start with our desktop version. So we're going to start off with the page container, right? Let's take a look at this mockup again. So I'm seeing two columns and essentially just going to be two rows. It's not going to be 50-50, so I'm going to just say this is like a 60-40 like ratio here. So let's just start with doing that. I'm going to say display grid templates, columns, 4FR, 6FR, right? And then for this row, I think I want to set this to be like a 500 pixels for this piece, and whatever's left over, I can let this one take it. So let's do that. Grid template rows, 1FR, 500 pixels. Let's give it a grid gap as well, so things aren't super close together. You can already see it starting to place items in this layout, right? So this is the small card. This is the medium card, and this is the main card. This is not the right layout, right? So let's fix this further. There's a lot of ways for us to individually take each piece here and like assign it into the grid. But one of my favorite ways to do it is template areas. So let me show you what this is about. So I'm just going to define, hold on. I'm going to lay out this positioning with names. So for example, I know that the top left is going to be a small, this one's going to be a main, and then on the next row, it'll be a medium card, main. So this isn't going to do anything yet because we actually now have to assign the grid areas here in each one. So grid area small, medium, grid area medium. Oh, sorry. And then grid area main. Did I type this correctly? Yes. Okay, cool, right? Like we instantly saw it coming back in, right? So now we have the small card in the right place. Here's the medium one, and here's the large one. So we have our desktop layout in the right spot now. So let's come back in and like fix up inside each card. So first up, we have the small card. You can see here that actually on desktop, this is a side-by-side layout, and it changes in mobile to be top and bottom. So I'm already thinking that I probably want to just do like a display grid, and I'll just change directions when I go smaller. So let's just focus on building out the desktop version first. So let's go to here, small, right? So I'm going to say this is a display grid, template, columns. Um, for now, I'm just going to use the same ratio, 4:6. And there we go. Okay, so at least now we have it side by side. Okay, I'm okay with this. For the medium card, this looks almost right. We just need to adjust a few things. The H2 element here, this text, it's taking up only 50% of this width in mockup. And I want this row to be rendered at the bottom of the cell. Right now, it's just auto placing itself. So if we look at the medium container, again, this you could use Flex here. I'm just going to use Grid because I'm just more familiar with it to create a single uh, column. And then, so let's deal with this text, right? We want this to be 50% width. Let's do that. And then remember how we said we wanted this to align to the bottom? What we can do is reference that row class and tell it to align itself to the bottom. There we go. So this is what I mean about positioning it both vertically. So yeah, this is an example of vertical positioning. Okay, so last is the main card here. I think this already looks very close to what we were looking for here. Um, actually, I think, let me increase the padding for everything. One moment. So 30 pixels. Yeah, okay. The only thing we need to fix is this comment card. If you remember, we were hoping for this, where we have an avatar and it's by itself, the name and the timestamp, and then text below it. So let's try and set that up. Um, okay, hold on, moving stuff. Let's go to our comment container. Okay, so we said that we want two columns and two rows. So let's define that. Grid template columns. I want the first one to be 50 pixels, and just whatever left remaining goes to the rest. Grid template rows, same thing. And then, right, so this is looking weird, right? Because this element is taking up the first column. We want it to move it to the second one. So what we can do is reference that class and then tell it that I want it to start at the start, at the second column. And there we go. So we have our desktop styling. I think this is like a good place for here. Actually, let me stop one moment. Does anyone have any questions, or if I'm going too fast, let me know. Um, Otherwise, I'll just keep going. Yeah, so let's implement the mobile version now. So here, let's reference back to our mobile mockup. I can see, oh no. Oh, yes, okay, sorry. Um, where did my Adobe XD go? Oh no. I guess I accidentally closed it. One moment. Yeah, sorry. Okay, on our mobile version, you can see that we have small card first, medium card, and then the main card on the bottom. So let's just quickly set that up. We can come back here and come back to this page container, right? So actually the bits that we've written here are for desktop. So let's move that into its own spot. See, screen LG. So this is saying that I'm gonna define the media query for the screen LG breakpoint, and I'm gonna move these two, and this one into this breakpoint. And I'm gonna change this now so that this is gonna be the mobile version. So we know that we were gonna have one column. The rows are gonna be, let's see. We were expecting the rows to be, let's just do auto for now. And then let's change this grid template areas. So it's going to be small. That's the first row, medium, and then main. So let's see what we have here. Okay, so you can see that it's already picking it up, right? It's going from mobile, and then it's keeping this layout all the way up to the LG breakpoint. So let's just adjust some things here. I want, oh, right. This card needed to be top bottom instead of side by side. So let's just fix that real quick. So this was the small container. So this is actually going to be the desktop version. So let's move it down here. Small container. Oh, shoot. Copying the wrong thing. Grid template columns. Move it here. And then here, I'm going to just change it to, let's see. I want to give it, it's a one column thing. And then I'm going to see what this does. So here we go. I think I need to add a little bit more space for this box. So I'm going to set grid template rows to be maybe 300 pixels. And then just let it take everything else. That's a little big. All right, well, good with that. And then so back here, I'm just going to change this to make sure it's just auto, so we're not going to affect the desktop version. So let's just take a look again. So yeah, we can see it flipping between the two breakpoints now. Next, we can see in mobile that this is a very, very tall item as opposed to what it's rendering right now, which is very short. So let's give it a little bit more space. So for this medium container, let's say that I want it to be, let's see, sorry, one moment. Medium container. I want it to be like a width, a particular height of, let's see, 500 pixels. Does this do anything? Okay, a little too big, but that's fine. And let me just check the medium container here, just making sure that I'm not going to overlap with anything. And we're going to reset it here on the larger breakpoint. So yeah, there we go. Okay, this is too big. I'm just going to drop this a little smaller. Okay, it's fine. So there we have the mobile to desktop movement. Oh, sorry, one more here. We needed to change this comment card so that the text left align. So what we can do is just change. So this is the comment container. I'm gonna copy and paste this into the large breakpoint so that I can manipulate this. Sorry. Right here, I'm going to say that it yeah, so this is the desktop version, so 2.1 is correct. I'm going to come back here and just change this to be 1, -1. So it starts, there we go. Yeah, so it starts at the left on mobile, and then on desktop, it right aligns again. Okay, so here is desktop and mobile. things are going okay so far. Let's talk about the in-between sizes now, right? So this is a process that I usually kind of do in my head, but for the sake of this presentation, let's let's visualize what I'm thinking about usually, right? The in-between sizes, there are like many possible ways we can lay out this metal section. So to help us guide ourselves, we can go back to what we mentioned before. We can try and discern a design intent and then see which one would be the closest to what we were trying to achieve. So, if we come back to our mockups, we can see that we were trying to say that there is a small bit, medium bit, and a main large thing here. And the mobile kind of follows along the same patterns, except for these two are kind of more the similar size. So when I look at some potential layouts for the medium, I'm sorry, the in-between sizes, like this one, for example, because this piece is much smaller than the card above it, which is supposed to be the small card, I want to like X this out as an option. These options number 1 and 3 are very doable as well. Because it's pretty much following that hierarchy pretty closely. But what I'm probably going to do is just choose number 1. I don't have a designer here, and I think that this is probably similar to what the mobile was trying to do, where these two were similar in sizing, and most importantly, this middle piece is still pretty visually large, and then the main card is still taking up the biggest piece. So let's try and implement this layout for the in-between sizes. Okay, so if we come back here, right, let's determine at one point would this start breaking apart, right? Already here, I think in the in-between size, okay, sorry. First of all, um, this is definitely too big for the mobile layout to still be in. You can see like a bunch of this color block here is rendering very narrow, which is against what this was trying to do and maintain in its mockups. So let's just set a medium breakpoint here where we're going to change something. Um, okay, so in here, let's define another grid. Nope, sorry. We already have grid defined. We can just set grid template columns. And we're going to do repeat 1 FRs, right? Because the effect that we were trying to do is 2 equal size columns. And then I'm going to set grid template rows to be auto. And then let me define the areas that I want. So in this in between size, I know I want, sorry, small, medium on the first row, and then main on the bottom, the next row. Um, sorry, I have misspelled this. MD. So you can see already that the layout has already started to change, right? We've already pushed those 2 pieces up very easily. And it still changes from mobile to tablet to desktop. We could probably adjust this a little bit more, but I'm going to stop here and yeah, so that we have some time at the end here. Okay, I'm going to change back to my other screen, but hopefully this is a walkthrough of how we could be implementing responsive layout and the overall organization of this. Notice here, like, this is what I mean about um, consolidating all the places where we have media queries. Instead of putting it in small container itself, I've put it in here on the layout so that at one glance, I can tell everything that's going to change when the LG breakpoint changes for this page. Okay, so we can still see everything now, right? Okay, so hopefully through this exercise and this presentation, let's just go back to where we started, right? We had 2 common questions that we wanted to answer. what happens for the in-between sizes if we're only given a desktop and mobile mockup? Um, Hopefully you guys picked up that you can unblock yourselves and figure out what the design intent to gauge what layouts you should consider implementing in the in-between sizes. And whether it's the next question of, is it mobile first or desktop first when we write CSS? Um, it's it's up to you which one it is. It's a personal preference, but most importantly, you're going to be considering both of them at the same time when you start writing it, because that directly impacts how you would organize your HTML and CSS. If you wanted to learn more about any of these topics, I recommend these links. The link for this slide deck is also available here. And that's all. Thank you for listening and for staying on with me through this journey. If you have any sort of feedback on my content or my delivery, please let me know. I'm always looking to improve.